Well, welcome to the Medical Device Innovators podcast. This week, I have with me Paul Gibbons from Corin, and we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about orthopedics, but we're still going to keep kind of the common theme that we've had for a couple of episodes now about robotics. So we're going to see how the intersection of orthopedics and technology. We'll talk a little bit about that and really the impact it has on that sector of healthcare. But to start with, Paul, welcome. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, how you ended up here and what you do for Corin?
Thanks very much, Arlen. So at the moment, I'm the MD for Corin in the UK. So I'm responsible for the UK business of Corin, which is growing to be one of the medium players in the orthopedic business. Original business based out of the UK. Our worldwide headquarters are centered in the UK, with business across Europe, across Australia, and across the US in both the hip and the knee, really focused in the primary joint replacement markets now. We had a lot of different products over time, but now we've refined down our product ranges and spend most of our time talking about primary hip replacement and primary knee replacement.
Those seem to be the major players in the orthopedic market. I imagine that's probably the biggest markets.
So yeah, biggest markets at the moment. Growing population. Everybody's getting older and getting joint replacements done at younger ages. So we have the situation where there's a growing market, and at the moment we have, especially in the UK, a lot of backlog post-COVID. So UK was one of the countries that locked down the hardest on elective surgery. And recent papers are saying that we've got between 5 and 10 years of catch-up to do on COVID surgery in the UK, whereas some of our European counterparts have already done their catch-up. So there's different ways of people going about that at the moment.
So even though it has a lot to do with mobility and quality of life, it's still considered to be an elective surgery. There's not a lot of those replacements that are done on a life-saving basis, I guess.
No, not really. I mean, you have some trauma, some fractured neck of femur trauma that happens and that continues on in the background. But most of this is taking people who have pain, a disability, a difficulty in walking, difficulty in sleeping and carrying out their activities of daily life, and then replacing their joint. And I mean, hip surgery, one of the things is hip surgery is so successful. It's one of the most successful surgeries you can have at getting a person back into work, getting a person back into pain-free life. It's a really stable joint, ball and socket. There's really proven technologies to get a replacement in there, to fix it in there and have a good bearing in there over time. So hip replacement's amazingly successful. Knee replacement's slightly less so. And there's a lot of people who band around the 20% dissatisfaction rate, but you've got generally a unstable joint in the knee that you're trying to replace. You've got two skids against a flat plate. And therefore, there's a lot more factors that can come into play there. And there's probably more to solve there. So there's a lot of things that have been solved in hips. We've still got 20% of patients who are walking around saying, I'm not really happy with my knee surgery at the moment.
And how is Corin headed out to solve some of those issues? Let's start with the hip side of things, since it's the easier of the two.
So the hip side of things, Corin goes way back. So Corin goes back into the 1980s and originally started off doing a lot of work in hip resurfacing. So that's starting to regain some popularity at the moment, but especially in younger patients, rather than chopping off the femoral head, you're putting a surface over the femoral head and then a large socket for it to go against. But once we had the disasters with the metal-on-metal bearings, with the ASR issues and the large recalls with that, we stopped work in that area and we changed to going for a sort of standard, well-proven portfolio of products. So the foundation of anything that's going on here before we get into technology is to have well-proven product. If you don't have well-proven product, there's no point in adding technology to them. And in the UK, you have a lot of clinical ratings that you have to gain before you can get accepted into a lot of the hospitals. So ODEP ratings, based on the number of years, you can have an ODEP 3, a 5, a 7, and 10, up to about an ODEP 15 now. So that's the first bit of the foundation of the platform for Corin. But about 8 years ago, Corin started thinking about, okay, how do we assess how a patient moves and use that to plan better where the hip replacement goes in 3 dimensions. So we've always planned in the past in 2D with X-ray and then gone in and placed in the operation the implant in the right place. About 15 years ago, we had navigation systems that came in. People used that to plan and then intraoperatively put the implant in place. But actually, after about 5 years and a lot of money spent by a lot of different people, the outcomes were pretty much the same. Surgery was longer, slightly more difficult, and you started seeing these systems turning up in the hallways in theatres because they weren't being used anymore. They almost became an educational tool that didn't drive anything. So Corin's approach was slightly different. It was to look at how patients move and how spinopelvic movement, so how the pelvis is connected to the spine and how that can move different in different people. And the finding was in about 17% of patients that moves in a different way. And that it can either anterior rotate or posterior rotate, which affects the 3D positioning in space of the femur and the acetabulum. And how you pick that up is a difficult thing. Some surgeons will know it when the patient walks in. They'll walk stiffly, they'll sit differently. And they'll be able to say, okay, right, I need to be really careful with these patients because the issue could be impingement, dislocation, or longer term wear issues and therefore earlier failure. So Corin uses a system where it takes a number of x-rays at different positions, so deep-seated, standing, stepped up on a stair, and connects that data together with a 3D CT scan, sends it to some engineers in Sydney who then plan out the most optimal position, the femoral component and the acetabular component, taking into account that motion. Surgeon then validates that, and then intraoperatively we use a 3D printed PSI jig that replicates that plan and allows the implant to go in exactly that position. So that's proving quite successful. And in national joint registries, such as in Australia, about 2/3 of our components go in with that technology, and it's showing about a 50% reduction in complications. But in the big data picture of that, that's a very successful operation already. So you're incrementally decreasing it. But for that group of patients, any revision is too much of a revision. So if you're decreasing it for those patients, it's a successful piece of technology.
And even those small percentages, I imagine, translate to a large population over the course of, worldwide, because this is a very, very common procedure for sure.
Correct. And the other bit is looking at the cost of that revision. So a lot of the queries we get, especially working within the public health sector, is you want us to spend more on a CT scan and maybe one more X-ray preoperatively. What's our saving on the other side? And to be able to explain to them, okay, well, that revision could be costing you £14,000. If you want to revise that, you've got to spend a slight amount more on a CT scan and a bit of planning. But the sort of piece that we need to get better at is where you target that. So how do you pick up those patients early? And what's the technology that we might be able to use to almost triage patients coming in through the door to filter the ones who are that 17% one way and to treat the others in a completely normal way? So you sort of the economics of treating these patients is coming into play.
So that you're really spending that money up front, really only on the patients that need it, is kind of the goal from here going forward.
Yeah, if we can do that, that's a great step forward. We're not quite there yet. I think there's things that we can look at to do that, and there's a lot of talk about how this greater understanding by the surgeons about spinopelvics and the biomechanics of it is every year moving another step further forward. And there's published data on risk factor patients. So you're starting to say, okay, if it's an elderly female with a stiff back, then probably you've got a risk factor patient. So even without a lot of technology there's the data starting to show this out. And
you're leveraging a few other fairly new technologies in the 3D printed jig to go with this, and a lot of these things, kind of matured over the last 10 years as well. Are you relying more? I mean, it sounds like when you're talking about the surgeons looking at the patients beforehand, the better that they can screen them for which ones need the more intense or more costly surgical planning side of things. You're relying more on the surgeons for that. But then when it comes to the actual surgery, you're really trying to get that through as fast as possible, fix things, make sure that you're getting a very repeatable result through that set. Is that?
Yeah, so you've got two parts of that. You've got your preoperative planning bit, which we kind of talked about, then intraoperative delivery, which could be done in different ways. So once you've got where you want to be in 3D space, you've got to then put that in theatre in a simple way that doesn't sort of disturb the normal theatre process too much, and it doesn't cost too much in theatre. So you don't want to add much time to the theatre process. You don't want to make it too complicated. And recently for us, part of the problem has been the UK took the decision to leave Europe and do the Brexit thing. So our 3D printed jigs come from Belgium. And for a while, that's really difficult for us to get them shipped into the country because they didn't have the right sticker put on them. So there's a logistics piece within all of this as well that you need to make as simple as possible. So some of our surgeons really like the idea that you just got to work with this 3D printed jig, fit it into the acetabulum, fit one onto the femoral neck, do a cut on the femoral neck, and get your reaming correct to implant the cup in the right angle into the acetabulum. Other surgeons talk to us about, can we add more technology here? Can we go back to some simple navigation system or some other way of putting these things in 3D space? Because they want more of a flexible tool that will allow them to do different things with it, whereas the PSI jig is really a simple one use it once, that's it, and it's done. But it works. It's a simple way of achieving that 3D plan.
But even getting the preoperative planning done, even if you're not going to use the jigs and things like that, it certainly sounds like there's a lot of advantages for the surgeons to just get the imaging, get the plan done, make sure things fit like they're supposed to before they start.
So absolutely, I think that the shift there is looking at how all patients move slightly differently. Can we take that into account? Patients are 3D structures, obviously. Let's take that into account. And then have a plan to start with. And sometimes that plan is a filter. So it might pick up things that are problems for that patient. So the surgeon knows that before going into theatre. And it may be acting as that filter before they walk in. So they go, okay, this one's got that problem. I need to be aware of that going in. Kind of interesting is, where's the power effect on the outcome? Is it the 3D planning and just using that, or how much of it is the 3D planning combined with the intraoperative delivery and then what goes on afterwards? And I think it's the whole piece. Obviously, if you can get everything, it's better. But in some cases, you might be getting the point of, right, 3D plan, look at it, compare it to the anatomy. Right, I'm pretty much going to put that shell in that position in the acetabulum. That's maybe the biggest step forward that you can do.
I mean, just thinking of the parts of that system, around the hip, there's a lot of things that aren't the hip that are going to impact, how that new implant performs. Like, I'm just thinking the lower back and even, gait and, all sorts of things. I mean, not just the tip of the pelvis and things like that, but I mean, there's so many other parts and so much of the weight of the patient are being passed through that area that it can get complicated fairly quickly.
So we all get a bit myopic on the way we look at things when we're really focused onto something. And hip surgeons have been very focused on the total hip joint and around that. But take a step back and it's all connected, from ankle to knee to hip to spine. And if you change one piece, the body's going to try and affect it in another way. So I think we're starting to get better at zooming out and understanding that and having the imaging modalities that allow us to look at that wider. But we've still not got all of that stuck together yet. It's sort of piece by piece. And maybe in 5, 10, 15 years, we're going to be understanding more of how that works, but also how the soft tissue affects all of that as well. So at the moment, we're pretty good at simulating and working out on bony structures, but then to simulate all the different soft tissue structures around that, it's very complicated for us at the moment.
It sounds like one of the major focuses for Corin is really to take it more as a system approach rather than an individual procedure, individual action for a specific patient, but you're more trying to look at the whole patient, the whole process. I mean, whether we're talking about the patient and how they come in the door, all the way through, the supply chain issues of trying to get the jig in the hands of the people that need it. All of those are part of a much bigger system than usually, like you said, is is the more myopic view of a procedure.
I think the other piece around this that we're starting to understand is how do we gather the data? So exactly what you said, that there's a lot of different factors that apply to this. And some people would say to you, actually, if you look at outcomes, having a good parking spot when they come to the hospital actually is having more effect on the outcomes than some of the other smaller factors that we start to look at. So being able to look at a bigger data set around how we improve patient outcomes, patient survivorship is really, really useful in where we're going. And we all talk about data and there's the gold is in the data and things, but I think we're only at the cusp of this. So we're starting to gather preoperative patient data through patient trackers that sit on your phone that allows the surgeon to see if this patient is moving in a standard way preoperatively. That then feeds in and is combined with postoperative data by the same style of tracker to say, okay, postoperatively, are they doing the right amount of exercises? The tracker will also suggest to them, this is your physio, this is your tuned physio for you. But then we start to connect that preoperative data with the intraoperative plan that was achieved and the postoperative data. And then afterwards, you start to look at that and go, okay, in a big data set, what's good, what's bad? What are the things that are affecting things differently? Now, that can be for that surgeon, for that surgeon's operation, or you can then step out and start going wider and wider and going hospital, country, global data set. And that's kind of exciting. And some parts of us would think, actually, that could be the biggest shift that we see in patient treatment and patient outcomes is a bigger understanding of what's hiding within that data set at the moment that we don't understand.
Yeah, I can imagine chasing fractions of a percent in a inside the OR, adding millions of dollars in robots and things like that, and then realizing that you can spend a few dollars on signage for the parking lot, is a great sell for hospitals that, yes, we can improve your procedure, but really as part of this process, you need to look at, your whole facility, where you locate, these departments in relation to that parking lot. Because I would have never thought about, the walk-in from the car as part of the procedure, but it certainly sounds like those sorts of things have an impact.
Patient mental attitude is key. If you get somebody who comes in who's thinking, oh, this is all going to be really terrible, it's going to be really hard, I'm going to have a real problem. We all know that if we approach a problem like that, if we open Excel on a really bad day and start looking at budget figures and we've got a bad view of it to start with, it's not going to be a good view of it. Whereas if you start off, you're more relaxed, you've got an open mind, you're looking in a positive way, you're probably going to have a better experience in your joint replacement journey. And therefore, you're going to start rehabbing in a better way, in a better format in the future. So not an area of my specialism, but there's people looking at that sort of area to say, okay, what are the effects of these different ways of that patient journey?
Yeah, and that end result, that the data that you end up with and the cost associated with those changes, are driving the innovation side of what you're focused on next.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're starting to see. So for OPS, we originally worked with an Australian company, Optimized Ortho, and then we brought them on board. And so we've got quite a big data set there already, and that's starting to suggest different opportunities to us for internal developments, but also for research with other groups. So groups can come to us and go, look, we're really interested in this area. We know you've got a big data set of total hip arthroplasty treatment in 3 dimensions with this dynamic analysis. What can we compare our data set to your data set and see where we're going with that? So we're really open to that. And there's a number of different papers that are getting published in that sort of way. But it's having that 3D data helps us also look at, what's our size ranging on our next level of implants, or if we start to change the design of our stems in the femoral side, are we doing the right thing? Is it the right level of fixation? Because the stems at the moment work pretty well. So if we start changing things, we don't want to end up with another problem that starts showing itself in 5 or 10 years' time. So all that sort of data can help us in the things that we're developing. And I think, we're at a point where a lot of money has been spent in the past developing the next generation of implant, And these are all kind of incremental changes. And when you look at the change in the outcomes of those, they're very small changes. We're getting to that point where most primary hip and primary knee systems are working really, really well. And so everybody's looking for what's the next thing? How are we going to improve it? How are we going to differentiate in the marketplace, but how are we going to improve a patient's life at the end of all of this? And maybe now the focus is shifting away from every 5 or 10 years developing a new implant system, which is really expensive and it takes a really long time now to get through regulatory, to looking at other ways of things that you can iterate quicker through data, through technology, and bring them into the marketplace.
Well, that's always been one of the major shortfalls of healthcare is while that data may be available, it's certainly not organized in a way that's accessible to any group, really. Each hospital had their own record keeping. There wasn't, no way to kind of bring that all together in one spot. So if you have a large data set around hip and knee replacements, one, that's got to be extremely valuable, like you said, to find those insights. But it didn't happen by accident. Someone had to really say, this is going to be something that we're going to grow over time and be able to leverage and work through it. So.
Yeah, and there's a group of people. So there's a group of people who ran the startup in Australia in optimized ortho to start with, but then there's a group of people who developed a number of different implant systems over time in the management teams who are going, this is going to cost us a lot of money to develop another one, and what are we going to get for it? So yeah, I think there's a degree of internal analysis to say where do we go from here.
And the technology that you're using on the hip replacement side, is that the same workflow, same technology that you use for the knee, or how are they different?
So knee's totally different. I suppose it's totally different, but we're still trying to assess how the patient moves and put an implant in a better position for how that patient moves. So still use a standard implant, proven implant, good clinical history implant, well designed, works well, lasts a long time. But how can we do the next step of putting it in relative to how that patient moves? So there's lots of different robotic systems out there. There's robotic systems have developed over time. We know that, we can see them. There's big ones, there's small ones, but most of them are target-driven robots. So again, it's a bit like we're talking about in hips, is that you're trying to achieve a target intraoperatively from something that you've planned preoperatively. So some of them are taking CT scans and using that on a 3D plan. Some of them are taking 3D data intraoperatively and morphing that from models. But all they're trying to do is achieve a target. And if you achieve a target, that's good. You're decreasing some of the problems that would be if you're putting it in the wrong place, because we're all humans. Surgeons are humans. They have good days, bad days. Things get put in slightly differently relative to the patient. And if you put some robotics in there, you're narrowing down those standard deviations, so you're getting accuracy and repeatability out of it. However, that's not what we looked for. We looked for something else. We looked for something that would take us similar to what we had in hips and assess the patient's movement and then put the implant in. So what we have is something, the Omnibotics system. So it's for primary total knee arthroplasty. But what it does is has a robotic spacer called the Omnibot, which takes data through full flexion extension of the knee and uses that soft tissue data to then drive the optimal placement for the implant. It suggests to the surgeon intraoperatively, it says, okay, you've given me this data, so you've taken the knee through full flexion extension with the Omnibot in place. That then gives the soft tissue data to the surgeon and it says, okay, I think it's a size 4 and it should be put in here. Surgeon reviews that, then the surgeon can adjust different attributes for that placement of the knee, and then he can see theoretically the effect that would have on the soft tissue. Because with a knee being a more complicated joint, a more unstable joint, a more soft tissue driven joint, if we just cut out what's there and replace it, we might be ignoring what the soft tissue is driving that bony anatomy. So having that soft tissue data as well as the bony anatomy allows us to put an optimal position of knee in. And some of the clinical results coming out of the US multi-site data show an improvement in patient satisfaction, a decrease in complications. So it's starting to give us the data that looks really quite successful there.
And I imagine that it just, the less you require the soft tissue to conform to a new knee geometry or new, different size. If you happen to get that a little bit wrong, when you use the robot and you use that sizing and the placement, based off of the soft tissue itself, there's less. It needs to adapt over time. There's less pain. Things are moving sooner. You get the patient, back on their feet. To say.
Yeah.
So
I think we have some data there. We don't have all the data, but what it's showing is less. The surgeons having to do less releases in theatre, which means that they're having to do less sort of small resections of soft tissue data to balance out the knee. Mm-hmm. In doing less of that, they get less pain. So if you're getting less pain post-operatively, you're more likely to get up and use it. The knee's more stable through full flexion extension. Now, what patients find is coming downstairs is one of the most areas where they're concerned because it feels like the knee's not stable. You're getting shift of femur over tibia because the soft tissues aren't as stable as they could be. But if you balance that fully through full flexion extension, then hopefully your soft tissue data is working well all the way through that, which means coming downstairs, you'll feel more stable. So you'll start rehabbing faster and going out there faster. So yeah, it's taking that into account, that soft tissue stability is getting you basically a happier patient faster.
It certainly sounds like a lot of this is driven by the outcomes. You're trying to stay focused on the end results, less so about the process itself. You keep it as straightforward and repeatable as you can. But what drives the innovation for Corin is really how much do you move the needle for the patient at the end of the day, and then balance that with those costs associated with that.
Yeah. Okay. So absolutely. So if it's not, it's a bit like we're talking about in hips. If it's not efficient in theatre, if it's meaning it's really longer or really more expensive in theatre, it's harder for that adoption. And if you're the budget holder in the hospital, you're asking significant questions of saying, why am I suddenly paying more to get this knee surgery? Am I getting the reimbursement back from the insurers or from the government? What you're looking to do is have something that flows well in theatre and is showing true changes in the outcomes afterwards. And different systems do that in different ways. But you've then got to wait a bit to get the amount of data at the end that shows that this is significantly different and how it's different.
So that being the major takeaway for someone wanting to develop something new in the orthopedic space, what other advice would you have for someone that's starting down the journey of, they have an idea or they have an improvement in mind, and where might they watch out for pitfalls and opportunities along the way?
So I think sometimes we can all get wrapped up in the technology. We can get really excited by the technology and lose focus on what's the actual change and what's kind of the power effect of that development that you're doing. So if you're looking at it in the future, you've developed this idea, but if it's only changing the needle that somebody's looking at very small, it's really interesting technology. We've never done it before. We've never had that information before, but it's not going to shift what's already a really, really successful operation that much. It's going to be that much harder to sit in front of somebody and say, the actual financial value of this innovation is X. It's really going to change the amount of time that people spend in a hospital bed before they go home. So it's really going to change the fact that they rehab quicker, which means that going from 2 to 3 days in a hospital bed with this innovation, we go to 1 day. That would be great. But if you're saying, actually, it's only kind of knocking off a couple of hours off, or it's maybe only going to affect them X years out, that's a harder, decision to put across to people. So we can all get wrapped up in the excitement of a development in an area that we've not done before. That's great. And sometimes you've got to gamble. You don't actually know how it's going to change that. So you've got to take the risk of saying, I want to do this. What's it going to do? And the other side of that is you don't want to change something to the effect where you might be making other things worse. So we've all seen enough developments over time that we thought were brilliant, or we thought that there was only just a small change, But then 3-5 years out, we start getting failures in the market. Patients are being affected. Recalls are having to happen. So it's two different sides to things. And regulatory-wise, I mean, we've talked before about how difficult it is in the European market with the new MDR regulations, how much time it takes to get things through to market. It's almost becoming an innovation killer. We've got to be really, really careful that how we can actually bring products to market, how costly it is for small, niche, innovative companies to bring things to market, because the cost of doing this now with the new MDR regs means it's going to take longer with more data, and we might risk damaging the ability to innovate our way out of orthopedic problems.
I really, over the course of my career, felt like that difficulty has shifted. It used to be that it was the U.S. market was considered to be the really difficult one to penetrate, and that with the new updated regulations in both of those markets, it seems the pendulum has shifted a bit to more of the European market being the harder one to get into.
It's really hard at the moment. I think it has the risk of killing off smaller companies who don't have the data that they need at the moment. And you definitely see other companies thinking, well, why should we be based in Europe? What's the advantage to us to be in Europe when actually we could be in the US, or we could be in Australia or somewhere Asia Pacific and develop things quicker and then just launch it backwards into the US in into the European markets in 5 or 6 years' time. And that'll be a real shame if it goes that far. I don't think it will, but it's definitely trending that way, that people are now going, okay, well, we'll look at our development dollars and we'll look at our development pounds and say, okay, we'll develop this to make sure we launch it US first. So we'll have teams in the US to take it on first and then come back later to other places. And that's a real change for Europe.
And that's certainly something that along the way, the regulatory bodies are going to have to look at it much like you were describing, looking at the patient outcomes. They're going to have to look at the kind of the innovation outcomes for their area and the unintended consequences of the changes that they make and make adjustments along the way. But that is certainly a slow moving change as it happens.
I think slow to glacial would be right. I part of the ABHI, the UK trade body, Association of British Healthcare Industry, who've been talking to the government here to say, hey, government, this could be real potential win for us having Brexited. You've got an island here that could be an innovation hub, but it's hard to knock on that door and get them to listen. We've got one thing that nobody else has got. We've got the NHS, which could be one of the best tools for proving new innovations and working in partnership to prove those. But we've got to get the systems in place that help industry to do that, which is pretty tricky at the moment.
That's certainly a moving target along the way. Certainly in Great Britain with all the changes and things there. So, well, I appreciate you taking the time and having a discussion about the orthopedic side of the market. Like you said, there's all sorts of new technologies that are coming out, and I think the reminder that it has to translate into improved outcomes, cost savings somewhere along the way, and that it's not just a procedure in a vacuum. It really does involve much more about the patient and their lifestyle and the system in which it's done. So I appreciate very much you coming on to talk to us today.
No, that's great. It's good to talk about it. I mean, these ideas and thoughts, they come over time and build to this sort of overall picture of where we are, but also where we're going to be. Where are we going to be in 10 or 15 years? What's the next big disruptive change? Or is it just incremental efficiencies that we're looking at going forward?
And if someone wanted to find out more about Corin or get in touch with you in particular, how would they go about doing that?
Very happy to talk to anybody on email or give me a phone. Obviously, there's Corin website, which gives you an overview of a lot of the different products, but it usually helps to talk face-to-face over a coffee at some point in time. So happy to do that as well.
Yeah, and now that we're moving further out of COVID, that becomes more of a reality too. So.
We realize very quickly how much we are humans that enjoy that face-to-face contact, not two-dimensional Zoom calls.
Oh, for sure. So, well, thank you again. And I appreciate all of the insights. And we'll be sure to include that contact information in the show notes.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alan.